Hello, my name is Andreas Schoenström. I am the Deputy Mayor of Malmö with responsibility for infrastructure and services. I'm very honored to be with you today to speak about Malmö and the experiences we have on changing our mobility and infrastructure into something else than we have today. I will show you some slides, of course, and I hope this will give you some both information and inspiration on what you can do in your city to change the structure of the city and using our common space in a better, more effective way than we do today. Now, let's begin. Malmö used to look like this back in the 80s. We had one of the biggest shipyards or wharf in Europe back then. We met in the beginning of the 90s a huge economic crisis. And of course, building big boats back then had become too expensive. More of these boats could be built cheaper in other countries in the world. We made a huge effort to try to change the structure of our city into something else than it was back then. Today, this is the same site. This is the home of the new neighborhood called the Western Harbor. We started to develop that back in the 2000 and 2001. And the development here on this site is still going on, but of course, most parts of this new neighborhood are built today. And the most interesting thing is that back then, when we had Kockums, our shipyard, we used to have about 7 to 8,000 employees working at the shipyard. Today, we have somewhere between 8,000 and 9,000 people employed in this part of the city, working on the same site where Kockums used to be. But of course, they are not employed by one company as they were back then. Nowadays, these between 8,000 and 9,000 people are employed about approximately 400 different companies instead. The future depends on space. Space are the most valuable assets a city has. But of course, it's also that asset that are most limited. This picture shows our harbor in Malmö. It shows where all the Toyota cars that are exported from Japan to Sweden arrives every day. Look at all the space it takes. Every single car takes approximately about 13.4 square meters. That's a lot of space that we could use to something else instead. And this is the problem with cars. It takes a lot of space. A car is only used about 2 to 3% of its life expectancy. The rest of the time, 97 to 98% of its life as a car, it only will be parked somewhere. And as long as it's parked, it's only going to use a lot of space that we as a city, that we as citizens of our city could use to something else. And how are we now going to address this challenge that we face as a growing city? Well, we have to use the space, as I said, in a new sense, and we have to share the space, the city space, between our citizens in a new way. And we have to do it in a space efficient way. So we all can use the space and we all can go wherever we want to create a mobility within the city so that everyone can go between their house and their work, of course, or go to school or go to the parks or whatever you want at your leisure time. So we have this structure, this hierarchy of our traffic. And I think you know this from already from other examples in other cities. But this is the hierarchy that we plan our infrastructure from. First and foremost are the pedestrians. Secondly, the cyclists. Thirdly, our public transport. In fourth place, we have the goods. In fifth and last place, we have the cars. So when we plan a street or an infrastructure, we plan it so everyone who are pedestrian get their area first, their square meters of the street, then the cyclists, then the public transporting, then the goods, and last the cars. This is the priority, the model for every infrastructure that we plan within the city. As I said earlier on, cars takes a lot of space. This is when a car are in movement. When a car moves, it takes about 22.1 square meters per person and car. If you're a pedestrian, that's the most space efficient way to move, 0.8. Public transporting, 1.2. Then we have the buses, 2.1, and the cyclist, 9.7. The difference between a cyclist and a car, of course, is that when you park the bicycle, it only takes about 2 square meters. So it's very, very efficient in every way you look at it. We have clear goals for where we want to be in 2030, and we are already achieving a lot of those goals. In 2013, we looked at our way of moving in the city and the mobility between our citizens. That showed that about 40% took the car, about only 22% cycle every day, and 21% used public transporting. In 2030, we have the goal that at least a third will use the bicycle, a quarter will use public transporting, and a third will use the car. But actually, we are achieving these goals already now in 2021. Today, we have about 30% who use the bicycle. The car has gone down from 40% in 2013 down to 34% now. So we are achieving this by setting clear goals and making a very clear priority when we prioritize planning the infrastructure. So we are achieving this, but of course, still, there are a lot of things that we have to do. The goals are that this percentage will stay though the more people move to Malmö. So even though that people are moving in and our population growth, the parts will stay still. If we are calculating that in 2045, we will be a 500,000 city. We will have grown from 340,000 now to 500,000 citizens. But the 30% for those who use the car will stay still. We have to plan our infrastructure so those who move to Malmö don't think it's necessary to use the car, but using other ways of movement. This is how we plan to have those goals broken down in different areas of the city. So for instance, where it says in the red area, number 1, in the city center, of course, we are planning our infrastructure so that many more people can go by bicycle or walk or use public transporting compared to car. And as we move further away from the city center and we come to the more rural areas of the city, we expect that lesser people or fewer people will use the bicycle and more will use the car. But this is very important to recognize the differences where we live in the city and don't expect that everyone can use the bicycle wherever you live, because it will look very different, the settings for your way of living when you live on the countryside or you live in the city center. And of course, we have to do not only things about the traffic we have within our city. Many of those who use the car today in Malmö don't live in Malmö. They only work here. So it's very important for us as well to plan in a way that we get more commuters by public transport and bicycle than we get by car. And this is a huge task in front of us, because of course me as a deputy mayor in a city has very little to say about other cities, how they plan, and the only thing I know is that many of the residents will travel each morning to Malmö to work and each night from Malmö to get home, and they do it mostly by car. But this we have to address. This is a picture of the street layout that I tried to show with the hierarchy I showed earlier on. You can see here on when we plan a street and the street layout, it's very important to first get the areas for the pedestrians and the bicycles. Then you get the areas for goods and public transporting, and at last you get the traffic, the street for the cars. But this is also making the public space and our streets more equal, because they aren't equal today. If you look at it, most of the space are used for those who use his cars. They have more to say about the space, the public space in a street, than, for instance, a pedestrian or bicycle. And this work is about doing each street more democratic in a sense, more equal between the citizens and the different ways of mobility. This is an example of how we prioritize in the traffic. If you look at the sign in the left corner here, you can see, as you may recognize, a man crossing the street, and the pedestrian have their say. The cars have to wait on the pedestrian. We also combine this with a sign for the cyclist. So if there is a cyclist who wants to cross the street, they have the cars have to wait on that cyclist as well. It's about making rules and prioritize in the traffic, showing what the hierarchy actually is. The cars have to wait on the cyclists and pedestrians. The cars are not efficient and don't have the same saying about who goes first in the traffic. It's about making a privilege for those who cycle and those who walk compared to those who use a car. Malmö, as I said earlier on, we are achieving a lot of those goals that we already set up. Today we have about 500 kilometers, or actually 520 kilometers of bicycle lanes. About 1/3 of every journey is done by bike today, and about 2.3 bicycles. Every household owns about 2.3 bicycles today. And this was not easy, but we achieved it by prioritizing cyclists at stoplights and road crossing. We invested a lot of money in bicycle lanes today. In Sweden, it works like this, that if you want to build a house, you have to, as a developer, also invest in the streets and the pedestrian areas surrounding that house. So many of those developers who's built house today in Malmö has also had also made an investment in bicycle lanes and pedestrian areas surrounding their house. We have opening new service stations. We have rental bikes, of course, as many cities. And don't forget this, we have increased the price of parking in the city a lot of times. This for the purpose that those who want to park in the city center, they can do so, but they will pay the money that area costs for the city to uphold for cars. As I said earlier on, a car in average take about 13.4 square meters when it's parked, and the drivers need to pay for that space. This is not popular always, but it also strengthened the case for using the bike instead, or public transport. If you want to use a car, you have to pay the fees for what that car takes in space and from the environment. And of course, we have narrowed many lanes for the cars and use that space to create bike lanes instead. We also took a political decision about a new policy and norm for mobility and parking in Malmö. In Sweden, I don't know how it works in South Korea, but in Sweden, it works like this, that when you are building a new house or developing a new house, you are by law forced to build parking spaces for all those who will work or live within that house. And those parking spaces need to be within the house that you are building. This is very, very expensive. Every parking space is extremely expensive and will be put on the rent or the selling price for that apartment or that office space that you are selling. So we created a new norm in Malmö. And this is shown in this map. If you are building, for example, if you are building a new house within the green areas, either a house along the new bus lines or along the Malmö Pendeln or in the city center, you almost don't have to build any parking spaces. Instead, you have to offer those who are going to the residents of that house, you have to offer them new mobility instead. Carpools or bicycles or free public transporting or something else instead of building parking spaces. And why I say this is very important is that will also decrease the price, lower the price of living in Malmö. If a developer today want to build a house, and building a parking space beneath the house underground, it costs about 340,000 or 34,000 euros each parking space. And those 34,000 parking euros will be put on the price for that apartment that you're going to buy. It's very, very expensive. And most of the residents in the city center don't even have a car. So they are paying 34,000 euros for a parking space they don't need. If we say that developer who are building that house, instead of building that parking space, can offer a part in a carpool or a bicycle or a free public transporting for those residents they have, the price of each apartment will become 34,000 euros cheaper. So this is very important, how we use the norm to steer the mobility in a way it's in a benefit for everyone. It becomes much cheaper for people move within the city. It becomes more cheaper to buy an apartment. But of course, for the city as a whole and all the citizens, we use the space in a more efficient way. We also have, the city owns today a company called P Malmö, Parking Malmö. They mainly have parking houses. And we are now going to change those empty parking houses into mobility hubs instead. Instead of the city letting out new empty parking spaces, we will be letting out these mobility hubs where every new vehicle that you can share with one another will have a space instead. So in those parking spaces, we will fill them with carpools, bicycles, electric scooters, and mopeds. So instead of renting an empty parking space for your own car, the city of Malmö instead will have the access to Mobility Malmö, where they can rent or lend any vehicle that they use and need for their specific journey. This is a picture showing how we use the new space in a new way. And this is how it used to look. This picture also shows how it used to look in the city planning back in the 60s and early 70s. If you look in the middle of the picture, you can see these white houses. All those white houses are built along a street. In the middle along the street, there will go a new express bus in the future. And the parking spaces surrounding that street on each side will be used to build new houses instead. Here's another example. This is Leonsborgsgatan, how it looks today. As you can see, back in the 60s and 70s, when the car was the future, every city and city area were built and planned for the car. This is an awful example of how you use space to absolutely nothing. You have the street, there the car drives. Then you have green hedges on both sides. On the other side of the hedge, on the right side, you see parking spaces. And there's another street going parallel to this street, the main street. And the other street are only used for accessing those parking spaces. And I always ask people when they see this photography if they think that people living on the one side of the street know people who are living on the other side of the street. I don't think so, because it's so far apart between the houses, and there's nowhere along the street where people can actually meet one each other. So it becomes a very distant and very bad example of city planning. Only plan for a car, only plan for passing by the living areas, never for people to meet. In the future, the same street will be looking like this. We take away the parking spaces, putting the cars preferably in garages instead. Use the space to build new houses, new offices, new living. We have a clear space for the pedestrians, for the bicycle lanes, for the public transport to go in the middle of the street. And of course, we have the crossings there where the people from each side of the street can meet one each other, either by the bus stop or perhaps by some of the shops or working spaces on either side of the street. The same space, but used in a more sensible way than today. This is another example from Rosengård Center. As you see, it's an odyssey of asphalt and concrete. This is how it looks today, planned for the car. Tomorrow, hopefully it will look like this. Exactly the same street, the same place. We take away the huge space that were built for the cars, lowering everything to one on the ground floor. So everyone moves in the same level. The space are used for building new houses and new workplaces, and of course for people to either go by bicycle or walk or something else. The things that they couldn't do were in the old with the old city planning. And of course, this is a very good example. This is the neighbor to the Western Harbor, as I showed in the beginning. This will be called New Harbor. And we have the central station in the north of the picture. The rest of the space will hopefully look like this in the future. This will be a very dense area, living area, planned mainly for public transports and bicycles, not for your own car, with workplaces closest to the train station. And as further we come from the train station, a more of private living houses and so on will take over. And as you see, the bridges here are narrow. That's because they are mainly for bicycles and public transport, not for cars. We move away the cars, and in the summer month, we on the same street have this walking area where you can walk or you can bicycle. We let the restaurants along the street move out, taking the space for their businesses and creating this lovely area where many of the people living in Malmö wants to stay and meet one each other, want to socialize. And this is, I think, a very good example of how you can use exactly the same space in a new way, just changing some things and taking away the car. I hope you have enjoyed my slides. I hope this have given you some inspiration on what you want to do with your city. I am so glad I got this opportunity to tell you about our work in Malmö. I hope you have really enjoyed it. And what I really hope is that I someday could travel to your city and get inspiration from your work. I think we are many cities around the world that are facing exactly the same challenges. And I think that we have something to do in common. Thank you very much.